change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And what's interesting here is that even though Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, he is also called a Kenizzite. And that's a Kenizzite, and that's from being on his father's side. And Kenizzites, they were native people from the land of Canaan. And you kind of find them listed over there in Genesis 15:19. So apparently, sometime down in Egypt, this family of Kenizzites became attached to the tribe of Judah. And now Caleb, his name here, it means dog, and he tells us that he's 85 years old. This is how we get our timeline for how long it took for Israel to conquer Canaan. Because him being 40 years old, and then you add the 38 years of wandering in the wilderness, and then you minus the 85 years for his age, it leaves us with 7 years. So Caleb, he has been waiting these 45 years for this promise of receiving his inheritance from the land where he trod to be fulfilled. And he's not going to leave it up to some lottery. And then we're told here that, well, like how Joshua, how he was old and stricken in years, and he's kind of getting a little bit frail. It tells us that Caleb's not, and that Caleb is as strong as he's ever been, and he's able to make war. And so he's kind of like Chuck Norris. He's been fighting battles his whole life, and he's not scared of anyone. And he's not asking for an easy piece of land so he can build his retirement cabin, so he can go out on the porch and rock. He's asking for the mountains where the giants are, who aren't conquered yet. And these are the same giants that he saw 45 years ago when he told Moses that God could conquer them and that they would be his bread. Well, Caleb, he's saying here that he's still hungry. And so Caleb is given what he was promised. And it was right for him to be the first in Israel to receive his inheritance. And so he's given Hebron, which used to be called Kirjath Arba. And Arba is the name of the father of Anak. And Anak, he's the father of the giants, the Anakim. Right, so after Caleb's taken care of, the lottery begins. And Judah, being one of the larger tribes, it receives the first lot. And he's the big winner here. And so he gets that large area in Canaan. And so it's basically the whole south, between the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Dead Sea. And it just happens that the tribe of Judah receives the territory where Caleb, who is also of Judah, where his inheritance is, because his inheritance is Hebron, which happens to be in Judah. So that all kind of worked out. And then we get to another story about Caleb, where we hear about how he drove out 3 sons of Anak, and it gives their names. And their names were Shisha and Abedmen and Talmai. And they're mentioned all the way back in Numbers 13:22. So that was when Caleb originally spied out the land. So those 3 giants, they have been here this whole 45 years. And Caleb, he's been waiting to get at these guys his whole life. And now Caleb, he's 85. And so I'm guessing that these giants, they might be 85. But I don't think that Caleb was chasing them around in their walkers. And then it mentions these same guys when you get to the book of Judges chapter 1. So these are famous giants. And then Caleb, he goes and he makes this really strange promise to give his daughter away in marriage to whoever can be the one who can conquer this other city of giants called Kirjath Sepher, which is later called Debir. And the way I see this story, and I'll admit to you, it's not right. But what I think is like, okay, well, hey, Caleb, you're 85 years old. So how old is your daughter? I mean, is she like 50 or 65? So I'm really kind of wondering, well, what kind of prize is this? But I'm sure she was a beauty. And though it might be kind of odd thinking to us, but you're kind of thinking, well, what is he thinking? I'm going to give you my daughter if you can go get me some more land. But I don't think that was Caleb's motive here. But I was thinking I could probably give away Salem if I could get someone to clean the garage. If I could do that, then we might be able to make a deal. But I really don't think that this was Caleb's intent at all. I think what he's trying to do here, that he's actually trying to take care of his daughter. And it's maybe more like, if you want to marry my daughter, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to prove yourself worthy. So the way I think of it probably was more like if someone wanted to marry one of our daughters, well, and the man you'd want to marry your daughter would be one who would have a good job, or a job, or they would have the same beliefs that your family believes, that they have the same values. Where this man here, he would have the same beliefs that Caleb had, about how Caleb thought about God, where that through God's help, I can fight any battle, that all things are possible with God's help, because that's how Caleb believes. And so the great winner of this great prize of marrying Caleb's daughter, Akshah, was Caleb's very own nephew, Othniel, who is the son of Caleb's own brother, Kenaz. And so you can see here that he came from a really good family. And this actually became a very, very good choice, because we will see him later in the book of Judges, because Othniel becomes the very first judge in Israel. And then it looks like, for a wedding gift, that he had given his daughter Akshah a field for a wedding present. And she seems to know her father pretty well. And she also knows he's kind of generous. So she approaches him and she asks him for a spring too, because she wanted a spring to be able to water her new field. And what it looks like to me is that Caleb, that he's doing everything he can to be a blessing to his family. Because when you are 85 years old, you really don't need that much more stuff for yourself. But as a good father, you always care about your kids' future. And so she asks him for a spring of water, but he gives her two springs. He gives her the upper and the lower springs. Okay, and so the rest of chapter 15, it goes on, and it continues to describe the inheritance of the tribe of Judah, and then it talks about the cities that they inherited. And when you get down to verse 32, it says that there are 29 cities. But if you read the text, you'll see that there are 36 cities that are all named. And what they think this is that they probably included some of the villages that were actually outside of the walled cities, which made the count up to the 32. And then we're told in verse 63 that Judah didn't drive out the Jebusites out of Jerusalem, and that they still dwell there until the day that this book was written. And they will still be there until the time of King David, hundreds of years later, where he will drive them out with the help of Joab, the commander of his army. And so the thought here is that they could have driven them out, but for them to drive them out, it would have been hard, and they just found it easier to live with them. And then we get down to chapter 16, and this is the other one of the super mega lotto winners, and it's the tribe of Joseph, and where his children, who make up two of the tribes, and they're the large tribes of Ephraim and half of the tribe of Manasseh. And with these two combined, they are larger than all of the tribes in Israel. And then chapter 16, it describes all of their lands, and they receive this really beautiful piece of property, which is centrally located in Israel. And in Ephraim, that's where the national headquarters will be, and it'll be in Shechem, and that's where The tabernacle of the ark of God will stand there for over 300 years. And then when you get down to verse 16 in chapter 16, we find that Ephraim, that they didn't drive out the Canaanites in the city of Gezer, and that those Canaanites, that they still dwelt with them until this day, which is that same day of when this book of Joshua was written. But then you read that Ephraim made them forced laborers. And what that tells you is that they could have driven them out any time, but they didn't want to. And so they didn't obey God in this, and because they're thinking that they know better than God. And you have to remember that Gezer here from last week was one of the cities that Joshua had already conquered. And so for Ephraim, this was economical, and it made sense for them to keep them. But the truth is, if you can make somebody your slave, that means that you can probably drive them out of your land. And what we're going to see that happens when we get to the book of Judges, that these Canaanites in Ephraim, that they will actually become stronger than Ephraim, and they will make them forced laborers, and Ephraim will continually have problems because of this compromise that they made with the Canaanites. And then chapter 17, it goes on and it describes the other half of Manasseh's land, their inheritance on the west side of the Jordan. And then in verse 3, we hear about this man from Manasseh whose name is Zelophehad. And this guy, he had no sons, but he had only daughters. So these daughters, they go to Joshua and the high priest, and those girls, they go and they remind Joshua that the Lord commanded Moses to give them as daughters an inheritance because they were daughters of this Zelophehad, that God had already judged us, that they shouldn't be left out because their father only had daughters. And so they received an inheritance in Manasseh, but there were some restrictions that came with it, that they couldn't marry any men outside of the tribe of Manasseh, and if they did, they would lose their inheritance of property, because this would keep Manasseh's territory in the family of Manasseh. It wouldn't become another tribe's possession. And then we hear about Joshua's first complaint of any of the inheritance, and it comes from his own tribe, the tribe of Ephraim, where they're thinking that they should have got more land. And that's because they're big. And it says that they're a mighty tribe. We need more land because we're so large. And then they go and they call themselves a great people. So they're saying that they need special treatment. And they might be thinking that they would get special treatment because Joshua is one of them, because Joshua, he's from Ephraim. And Joshua here, he kind of gets away with speaking with Ephraim the way he does because he is one of them. Because we're going to see later as this country develops that this tribe of Ephraim, they get offended pretty easy. They have a lot of pride. They're a very emotional tribe and they take offense really, really easy. And Joshua, he says to them, he says, if you're such a great people, go out and conquer your land. Go kill giants. Go up into the woods and cut down some trees. And then you'll have plenty of land, but you're going to have to work for it. And then they come back to him still complaining, and they're saying, the people in the mountains, they're too tough for us. They have iron chariots. And then he mentions a couple of their cities up there. And Joshua, though he's going to admonish them, he assures them that they are a great people and that they have great power and that they can do this. And it doesn't matter if they have iron chariots. And you have to remember, it didn't matter when they conquered all the other nations that they had chariots. It didn't matter when they were following Joshua. And then their own leaders, they put their own feet on those kings' necks after winning a battle that they shouldn't have won. And they just burned a bunch of chariots. So that means that chariots really mean nothing when you have God. You're just going to have to trust God and work for it. And though the work will be hard and dangerous. And really, it's really no different than what 85-year-old Caleb and his family are doing. And so Joshua tells them, there's no more land. You have enough land. You have the forest up there. You are a great people. Now go out and prove it. Okay, and so now we get to chapter 18, and it starts there with 5 tribes of Israel. where they're already all settled in their land. And that all happened back there at Gilgal in that first lottery. And now the whole camp, they've moved up to Shiloh in this territory of Ephraim. And so this is where that tabernacle of God will remain until the reign of King David. But now you have in Shiloh, you still have these 7 tribes, and they're all camping out who haven't received anything yet. And it kind of sounds like Joshua, he's disappointed with these tribes by the way he asks this question. And he says, how long will you neglect to possess the land which the Lord your God, your fathers, has given you? Because they're just kind of sitting around and camping out, and they're not in any hurry to go out and possess the land. And then you think about it and you realize these people, they've never lived in houses, let alone ever lived in a city or in a town. They all grew up camping in the wilderness, so they're used to dwelling in tents. And so Joshua with the leaders, they come up with a new strategy, and they come up with this new system where they say that each of these 7 tribes will pick out 3 men from each tribe, and they're going to form this survey party. And they're going to go out and they're going to survey all the remaining territory. And it says here that there's still some territory in the south, and there's a lot more up there in the north. And so they're to go out there and divide it all up and to make it all even. And they're supposed to make it reasonable and acceptable to all the other tribes. And then they're to take it and they're to write it down in a book. Then you bring the book back, and then we're going to have our second lottery. And Joshua says that he will cast lots for them before the Lord in Shiloh. And so that's exactly what they did. And then that first lot, it fell to Benjamin. And so you'll see that Benjamin's territory, it ended up right next to Ephraim and Manasseh, which really actually makes sense because Benjamin was a full brother of Joseph. And so they're going to dwell next to the tribe of their brother Joseph, and they'll also be next to Judah, and they're going to share Jerusalem. And then the rest of the chapter describes, their cities, which included Jerusalem. And then the second lot, it fell to Simeon. And his inheritance was a little bit different than everybody else's because his whole territory fell inside of Judah's territory. So Simeon, he didn't really get a land or a territory to himself. But you don't see Simeon complaining. And you don't see Judah. They didn't complain either. He was willing to share what he had with his brother Simeon. But eventually what happened, because they didn't really have a land of their own, they, as a tribe, they became absorbed into the tribe of Judah. And they also say that some of them became absorbed into the other tribes of Israel because of some of the decisions they had made, where eventually they lost their identity as a tribe. And what that does, that fulfills this deathbed prophecy of Jacob, because the deathbed prophecy of Jacob was that Simeon and Levi, that they would be scattered in Israel. But where for the tribe of Levi, this became a blessing, where they didn't get their own territory, but they had a presence in all the cities throughout Israel. And they also get to serve God at the tabernacle. But for Simeon, it wasn't very good because their whole tribe, they kind of got lost. They lost their identity. And some people, they'll teach that the turnaround they believe for Levi was with Moses, and it was after that incident with the golden calf. And Moses asked him, who's on the Lord's side? And it was only the tribe of Levi who responded to Moses. And some people believe that's where it all changed for Levi. That's when they said that they were on the Lord's side, that's where the Lord chose Levi for himself. And then we get to the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th lots, and they fell to Zebulun and Issachar, Asher, and Naphtali. And they all received this land up north of Manasseh, which became known as the Galilee. And that's the area that Jesus came to minister. And it was called Galilee of the Gentiles. But here, the Sea of Galilee is called the Sea of Chinneroth. And Chinneroth means harp, because that sea was the shape of a harp. And then the last tribe to receive their inheritance was the tribe of Dan. And Dan, he kind of drew the short straw. And the territory that they received was next to Benjamin, which was a nice place to be. And it was also between Judah and Ephraim. But this land was a very hard land to settle because they inherited the coastal side of the Mediterranean Sea, and they're among all the Philistine cities. And by the time of the book of Judges, they lost almost all their land, if not all of their land, because it had been taken over by the Philistines. And so it says here that they migrated north to the most northern part of Israel, and they took the city that's called Leshan, which is also called by the name of Laish. But it doesn't matter what it was called because they came up with this really creative name to name it, and they named it Dan. You can read about all that in the book of Judges in chapter 18. And where he was the very first to claim his inheritance in Canaan, Joshua, being the humble man that he was, he waited till everyone else received their lands, and then he claimed his own inheritance. And where the others from his tribe of Ephraim, they complained about the mountains because the mountains was just too hard to settle because of the giants. Well, Joshua, like Caleb, he chose the mountains, and he asked for the city of Timnath-Serah. And Joshua, he built himself a city there to dwell in. And so now we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered 8 chapters. And then you can kind of ask yourself here, and you can say, well, how does this apply to us? Well, the way it applies to us is that God has given each of us an inheritance. He's given each of us things to possess in this life, and he's already given it to us. And it's going to be a walk of faith, and we're going to have to work hard, and we're going to have to battle to obtain it. And none of us will ever conquer all the things that the Lord has for us. And some of these things that actually hold us back from taking our possessions are these areas where we allow the enemy to dwell in our territories, where we don't battle them anymore, and we allow them to remain. And we believe either that they're just too strong, and where these giants in our land are these giant problems that we have, and we've lived with a lot of them for a long time, where they somehow seem so big and they've been with us so long, we don't think that we'll ever be able to defeat them. But that's not true if you're willing to battle them. God is big enough, and he will battle them with you, and he will deliver you. Or maybe it's not even the giants that are bothering you, but maybe it's that you don't want to drive the enemy out. Because to you, life doesn't look as profitable without them if you were to drive them out. That it's more profitable to you to compromise with them and to allow them to live in your territory, like Ephraim did, where they allowed them to live. But if you allow them to live, they're only going to get stronger, and they're eventually going to grow, and they're going to eventually try to subdue you and overcome you. But whatever you're battling, it's always going to be worth it to fight until you win. And you need to realize that when you battle, that God is with you, and he fights your battles for you. But you're still going to have to work hard at it. And then there's another thing you need to realize, that these battles, that they're going to continue for the rest of your life.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,